The rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors filled the silence as Thomas Anderson stared at the medical file on his desk, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the familiar name, Lily Mitchell. 10 years had passed since he'd last seen her, yet the mere sight of her name sent a jolt through his system stronger than his morning coffee. As chief of cardiology at Boston Memorial, he'd reviewed thousands of patient files, but none had ever made his own heart skip a beat like this one. "Dr. Anderson?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your wife is on line 1. Thomas glanced at his wedding photo, Marie's radiant smile, their hands intertwined, the promise of forever captured in a single frame. He picked up the phone, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hey, honey. Don't forget about dinner with the Harisas tonight," Marie reminded him, her tone warm but tired. After 15 years of marriage, she could read his moods even through the phone. "Everything okay? You sound distracted." "Just a complicated case," he replied, avoiding mention of Lily's name. The guilt of omission sat heavy in his chest. "Listen, I might be late tonight. There's an emergency consultation." "Thomas," Marie interrupted, her voice sharpening slightly. "We've rescheduled twice already. James is announcing his retirement, and he specifically asked for you to be there." He looked again at Lily's file, severe mitral valve regurgitation, requiring immediate surgical intervention. The woman who'd once owned his heart now needed him to literally fix hers. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I'll make it work," he promised, already knowing he'd spend the afternoon torn between past and present. After hanging up, he buzzed his assistant. "Send Mrs. Mitchell, Indiana." The woman who walked through his door was both achingly familiar and startlingly different from his memories. Lily's signature auburn hair had grown longer, elegant streaks of silver threading through it. Her green eyes, once sparkling with mischief, now carried shadows of exhaustion and fear. She'd lost weight, too much, and her hands clutched her purse with white-knuckled intensity. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly, her voice carrying echoes of lazy Sunday mornings and whispered promises. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me." "You're my patient," he replied professionally, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Your condition requires immediate attention." Lily sat down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile atmosphere between them. "I requested you specifically," she admitted. "I know it's awkward, but you're the best in your field, and I trust you." Trust. The word hung heavy in the air between them. Once, they'd trusted each other with everything, their dreams, their fears, their futures. Until the day she'd walked away without explanation, leaving nothing but a note that read, "I'm sorry. I can't." "The procedure is relatively straightforward," Thomas explained, slipping into his professional persona like armor. "But there are risks we need to discuss. Your heart structural integrity is compromised, and the surgery dash." "Will you do it?" Lily interrupted, leaning forward. "The surgery. Will you be my surgeon?" Thomas met her gaze, searching for any hint of manipulation or hidden agenda. But all he saw was fear, raw and genuine, mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify. "It would be better if he began. "Please," she whispered, and suddenly she was 25 again, looking at him with complete faith in his abilities. "I need it to be you." Before he could respond, his office door burst open. Marie stood in the doorway, elegant in her charcoal business suit, holding the takeout lunch she occasionally surprised him with. Her eyes darted between Thomas and Lily, recognition dawning on her face like a slow-motion car crash. "I'm sorry," Marie said, her voice perfectly controlled. "I didn't realize you were with a patient." But Thomas saw her hand tighten around the paper bag until it crumpled, saw the way her jaw clenched as she recognized the woman from the photographs he'd finally packed away years ago. "Marie he started to stand, but she was already backing away. "We'll talk at dinner," she said firmly, closing the door with deliberate softness that somehow felt worse than a slam. Lily watched the interaction with an unreadable expression. "She's beautiful," she observed quietly. "You look happy together in all the hospital publicity photos." "We are," Thomas replied automatically, then caught himself. "Lily, why are you really here?" She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across his desk with trembling fingers. "Because I'm running out of time, and not just because of my heart. There's something you need to know, Thomas. Something I should have told you 10 years ago." The envelope sat between them like a live grenade, and Thomas could swear he heard a second set of beeps beneath the cardiac monitors, the countdown to his carefully constructed life exploding into chaos. Thomas stared at the financial documents spread across his desk, his coffee long cold and forgotten. The surgery authorization forms bore a signature he didn't recognize: Richard Bennett, Lily's supposed fiancé. But something about the whole situation felt off, like a patient's chart where the symptoms didn't quite add up to the diagnosis. "Dr. Anderson?" His surgical resident, Dr. Sarah Chen, knocked on his office door. "We're ready to begin Mrs. Mitchell's pre-op procedures." He nodded, gathering the papers with hands that didn't quite feel like his own. The previous night's dinner with Marie played on repeat in his mind, her careful distance across the table, the way she'd smiled and chatted with the Harisas while her eyes remained cold, the silence on the drive home that felt like a preview of their future. "I'll be there in a moment," he replied, tucking Lily's envelope into his desk drawer. He hadn't opened it yet, couldn't open it, not when he needed absolute focus for the surgery ahead. But its presence haunted him, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. In the pre-op room, Lily lay pale against the stark white sheets, her auburn hair confined beneath a surgical cap. Her eyes found his immediately, and for a moment, he was transported back to their residency days, when they'd stolen moments between shifts, drunk on youth and possibilities. "Your fiancé's paperwork is in order," Thomas said professionally, checking her vitals. "Though I'm surprised he's not here today." A flash of something, fear, guilt, crossed Lily's face. "Richard is away on business." "Convenient timing for major cardiac surgery," Thomas observed, noting the way her heart rate spiked on the monitor. "Thomas," she reached for his hand, her fingers cold against his skin. "There's something you should know about Richard Dash." "Dr. Anderson," Sarah interrupted, appearing with the anesthesiologist. "It's time." In the operating theater, Thomas worked with the precision that had made him famous in his field. Each suture, each movement was calculated and exact. But as he repaired Lily's damaged heart, he couldn't help but remember how thoroughly she'd broken his. The surgery was nearly complete when he noticed it, a small detail that made his blood run cold. The scar tissue around her mitral valve showed signs of previous trauma, expertly hidden in her medical records but impossible to disguise under direct observation. This wasn't a congenital defect as her file claimed. This was damage from an impact. "Dr. Chen," he called out, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "Note in the record that there's evidence of previous trauma to the cardiac tissue, approximately 8 to 10 years old." 10 years. The timing couldn't be coincidental. After closing, Thomas headed to the recovery room to check on Lily. But outside her door stood a man he didn't recognize, tall, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit that somehow seemed at odds with his rough-edged demeanor. "Dr. Anderson," the man extended his hand. "Richard Bennett. I understand I have you to thank for saving my fiancé's life." Thomas shook his hand, noting the too tight grip, the barely concealed tension in the other man's stance. "Mr. Bennett. Your fiancé led me to believe you were out of town." "I was. But some things are worth dropping everything for." Bennett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you understand that sentiment, Doctor." "Of course." Thomas maintained his professional demeanor while every instinct screamed that something was wrong. "Though I'm curious why your name isn't listed in any of Mrs. Mitchell's previous medical records as her emergency contact." Bennett's smile tightened fractionally. Our engagement is relatively recent. But I assure you, I have Lily's best interests at heart. Speaking of which. He pulled out his phone, showing Thomas a photo that made his heart stop. It was from last night, him and Lily in his office, her hand reaching for his. I'd hate for your wife to misinterpret such a touching moment between doctor and patient, Bennett continued smoothly. Especially given your history with Lily. I'm sure we can all agree that some things are better left in the past. Before Thomas could respond, the recovery room door opened. Dr. Anderson? Sarah called out. Mrs. Mitchell is asking for you. She seems agitated. Thomas brushed past Bennett, entering the room to find Lily trembling, tears streaming down her face. He's here, isn't he? She whispered, her heart rate monitor climbing dangerously. Thomas, please don't let him in. Please dash. The monitors suddenly erupted in a cacophony of alarms. Lily's body went rigid, her eyes rolling back as seizures racked her frame. Code blue. Thomas shouted, reaching for the crash cart. But as he fought to save Lily's life for the second time that day, one thought burned in his mind: the envelope in his desk drawer might hold answers, but he was no longer sure he could live with the truth it contained. The hospital cafeteria at 3 a.m. was a liminal space where time seemed to stand still. Thomas sat alone, coffee untouched, his surgical scrub still wrinkled from the emergency intervention that had saved Lily's life. The envelope from his desk drawer lay before him, its contents now scattered across the table like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Police reports. Medical records. Bank statements. And photographs, so many photographs, telling a story that made his stomach churn. They documented Lily's relationship with Richard Bennett over the past year, but not in the way a loving couple would want to remember. Bruises carefully hidden beneath long sleeves. Security camera footage of confrontations in parking lots. Hospital visits in different cities, each under a slightly different name. I thought I'd find you here. Marie's voice cut through his dark thoughts. She stood in the doorway, still wearing her clothes from yesterday, exhaustion etched across her face. Your resident called me. Thomas looked up, suddenly aware of how this must appear, his wife finding him alone in the middle of the night, surrounded by evidence of his ex-lover's life. Marie, I can explain. She sat down across from him, pushing his cold coffee aside. Then explain. Explain why you didn't tell me Lily was your patient. Explain why you spent the night in the hospital instead of coming home. Explain why you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. He pushed the police reports toward her, watching as she scanned them with growing horror. She's been trying to leave him, Thomas said quietly. Bennett's been funding experimental treatments for her heart condition, using it to keep her dependent on him. The accident that caused her initial cardiac trauma? It wasn't an accident at all. Marie's hand trembled as she set down the papers. The night she left you, she began carefully, did she ever tell you why? No. Thomas ran his fingers through his hair, feeling the years of uncertainty crystallize into a terrible understanding. But I think I'm starting to piece it together. Bennett was her father's business partner back then. He'd been obsessed with her for years, but she'd always turned him down. Then suddenly, she disappeared from my life, and a few months later, her father's company mysteriously recovered from the brink of bankruptcy. A trade, Marie whispered. Her freedom for her father's salvation. But she never went through with marrying him. Thomas gathered the photographs, each one a testament to 10 years of quiet suffering. She kept finding reasons to delay, excuses to stay away. Until her heart condition worsened, and he finally had the leverage he needed. Marie reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. It was the first time she'd touched him since discovering Lily in his office. What are you going to do? Before he could answer, his pager buzzed, a 911 from Lily's room. They rushed together through the fluorescent-lit corridors, arriving to find Sarah trying to calm a hysterical Lily. He was here, Lily gasped between sobs. Richard was in my room. He said he knows about the envelope. Thomas, he's going to dash, she broke off, clutching her chest as the monitors began to wail. Get Bennett's photo to security, Thomas ordered Marie as he moved to Lily's bedside. No one except medical staff gets in this room. Hours later, as dawn broke over Boston, Thomas sat in his office, Marie asleep on the small couch he kept for overnight shifts. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thought you'd learned your lesson about taking what's mine. Check your email. The message that loaded on his screen made his blood run cold. Photos of him and Marie, at dinner, at home, walking in the park. Their daily routines documented with predatory precision. And finally, a photo of Marie at her law office, time-stamped just 2 days ago, with a red X drawn across her face. She doesn't have to end up like the others, a second text read. Step away from the case. Some stories don't need a hero. Thomas looked at his sleeping wife, then at the hospital room visible through his window, where Lily lay surrounded by machines. In trying to save one woman from a monster, he'd drawn that same monster's attention to another. And now he had to choose, his past or his present, Lily's life or Marie's safety. The answer came to him with surprising clarity. He wouldn't choose at all. There had to be another way, a path that didn't end in sacrifice or surrender. Bennett had spent years playing chess with people's lives, confident that no one would ever call his bluff. But Bennett had made one critical mistake, he'd threatened a surgeon's wife. And if there was one thing Thomas knew better than anyone, it was how to cut out a disease before it could spread. The hospital boardroom felt like a courtroom, with Thomas standing before his peers like a man on trial. Chief of Surgery Elizabeth Chen, Sarah's mother and his longtime mentor, sat at the center of the table, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the complaint in front of her. Dr. Anderson, she began, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of medical authority, Mr. Bennett has raised serious concerns about your objectivity regarding Mrs. Mitchell's case. He's provided evidence suggesting an inappropriate relationship with the patient. Thomas felt rather than saw Marie stiffen beside him. She'd insisted on being present, despite his protests. With respect, Dr. Chen, he responded, my history with the patient was disclosed upon admission. My primary concern has been her cardiac care, which has been successful despite unexpected complications. Complications you're suggesting were caused by her fiancé? Elizabeth's eyebrow arched. That's a serious accusation, Thomas. One supported by medical evidence, he countered, laying out the surgical photos showing Lily's old cardiac trauma. This injury pattern is consistent with severe physical trauma, not the congenital defect listed in her transferred records. The boardroom door opened, and Richard Bennett strode in, radiating expensive confidence. I apologize for my tardiness, he smiled, taking a seat opposite Thomas. I was just visiting Lily. She's quite distraught about these wild accusations. Because you threatened her, Thomas snapped, his professional demeanor cracking. Just like you threatened my wife. Thomas, Marie whispered, warning in her voice. But he was already pulling out his phone, displaying Bennett's threatening messages. Desperate measures from a desperate man, Bennett shook his head sadly. Dr. Anderson's obsession with my fiancée is clearly clouding his judgment. Those messages could easily have been fabricated. What's undeniable is his pattern of behavior, spending nights at her bedside, accessing her private records beyond medical necessity, making outlandish claims to interfere with our relationship. What's undeniable, Marie suddenly spoke up, her lawyer's training evident in her precise tone, is the pattern of Ms. Mitchell's hospital visits across 5 states, each coinciding with Mr. Bennett's business trips. Or perhaps you'd like to explain why your company has been paying medical bills for a woman you claim to have only recently become engaged to? Bennett's smile never wavered, but his eyes turned to ice. I've been helping an old friend's daughter through a difficult time. Lily's father and I were business partners until his convenient suicide 10 years ago, Marie interrupted. Right after you acquired controlling interest in his company. The same company that's now being investigated for massive Medicare fraud involving cardiac clinics across the country. The room fell silent. Elizabeth Chen looked between them, decades of political instinct warring with medical ethics. Mr. Bennett, these allegations are baseless, he cut in smoothly. And potentially libelous. I came here out of concern for Lily's care, but I can see this institution has deeper problems. Perhaps it's time to consider transferring her to a more professional facility. That would be inadvisable in her current condition, Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. Unless you're hoping for complications during transport. Bennett stood, adjusting his perfect suit. Dr. Anderson, your concern for my fiancée is touching, if inappropriate. But decisions about her care are no longer your concern. I've already filed for an emergency transfer order, citing your conflict of interest. A new surgical team will be taking over within the hour. You can't Thomas started forward, but Marie's hand on his arm stopped him. Actually, she said, her professional calm belying the tension in her grip, that transfer will have to wait. As of 20 minutes ago, my firm filed an emergency petition for a medical protective order on Ms. Mitchell's behalf. Until a judge reviews the evidence, she's staying right here. Bennett's mask slipped for just a moment, raw fury flashing across his features. You're making a serious mistake. No, Thomas replied, matching Bennett's cold smile with one of his own. The mistake was thinking you could walk into my hospital and threaten the people I care about without consequences. As Bennett stormed out, Elizabeth Chen fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. I hope you know what you're doing. Bennett has friends on the hospital board. I know exactly what I'm doing, Thomas assured her, but his certainty crumbled as his phone buzzed with a new message, check on your patient, doctor. Quickly. Thomas ran, Marie close behind him, their footsteps echoing through corridors that suddenly seemed endless. But as they rounded the corner to Lily's room, they knew they were too late. The bed was empty, the monitors silent. On the pillow lay a single red rose and a note, some debts can only be paid in person. Sarah burst in, panic clear on her face. Security cameras caught them heading to the parking garage. Bennett had paperwork, it looked official enough that the nurses didn't stop them. Dr. Anderson, she was barely stable, if they move her now Thomas was already moving, Marie's voice following him, I'll call the police. Thomas, be careful. He's not just desperate now, he's dangerous. But Thomas barely heard her. All he could think about was Lily's heart monitor flatlining for the second time in 24 hours, about Bennett's smug smile as he played with people's lives, about 10 years of manufactured distance that had cost them all so much. He'd taken an oath to do no harm, but as he raced toward the parking garage, he wondered if sometimes the greatest harm came from doing nothing at all. The choice he'd been avoiding now loomed before him like a physical barrier, his marriage or his past, his professional oath or his personal vendetta, the safe path or the right one. But as he heard the screech of tires and a woman's muffled scream echo from the garage ahead, Thomas realized some choices made themselves. The parking garage's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Thomas ran between the concrete pillars, following the sound of an idling engine. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, mixing with the pounding of his heart and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Let her go, Bennett. His voice bounced off the walls as he rounded the final corner. Bennett stood beside a black SUV, its engine running, one hand gripping Lily's arm while the other held something that glinted metallically in the dim light. Always the hero, aren't you, Thomas? Bennett's voice dripped with contempt. Still trying to save everyone. How's that working out for your marriage? Lily swayed on her feet, her hospital gown pale against the darkness, fresh blood staining the front where her fore had been torn out. Her eyes met Thomas's, glazed with a combination of fear and post-surgical drugs. You're killing her, Thomas said, taking a careful step forward. The surgery site hasn't had time to heal. If you move her now, the complications could be fatal. Like you really care about complications, Bennett snarled. This is about your precious reputation, your perfect life. Did you tell your wife about the real reason Lily left? About the baby? The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. What baby? Tell him, Lily. Bennett's grip tightened, making her whimper. Tell him about the choice you made. About our arrangement. I was pregnant, Lily's voice came out barely above a whisper. When I left you. Bennett, he said he'd ruin my father if I didn't terminate it. Said he'd expose the company's fraud, send everyone to prison. I couldn't. I couldn't let that happen. The truth of 10 years ago crashed over Thomas like a wave. So you left. Without a word. She did what she had to do, Bennett's smile was razor sharp. Just like she's doing now. Get in the car, Lily. No. The word came out stronger than before. Lily pulled away from Bennett's grip, stumbling toward Thomas. I'm done being afraid of you. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Bennett lunged for Lily, the metal object in his hand revealing itself as a syringe. Thomas dove forward, medical instincts screaming at the sight of an unknown substance about to be injected into his post-operative patient. They collided in a tangle of limbs, the syringe clattering across the concrete floor. Bennett's fist connected with Thomas's jaw, sending him staggering back. But before Bennett could reach for Lily again, a new voice cut through the chaos. Step away from them, Mr. Bennett. Marie stood at the garage entrance, her phone recording everything, 2 security guards flanking her. The police are 30 seconds out, and I've just sent this live stream to the district attorney's office. You don't understand, Bennett's composure cracked completely. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed, I won't let it fall apart because of her. It's already falling apart, Thomas said, tasting blood in his mouth. The Medicare fraud investigation, the pattern of abuse, the attempted kidnapping of a patient, it's over, Richard. Bennett's face contorted with rage. He lunged again, but this time not for Lily, for Marie and her damning phone. Thomas intercepted him, years of suppressed anger finally finding their target. They crashed into the SUV's hood, Bennett's head connecting with the metal with a sickening crack. As police cars screamed into the garage, their lights painting everything in red and blue, Thomas turned to find Lily collapsed on the ground, Marie already at her side, checking vitals with the efficiency of someone who'd spent too many years married to a doctor. She's tachycardic, Marie reported tersely. We need a trauma team down here now. Thomas knelt beside them, his professional mask slipping back into place despite his split lip and bruised knuckles. Lily, stay with us. Focus on my voice. The baby, Lily whispered, her eyes fluttering. I never wanted. I'm so sorry. Save your strength, Thomas took her hand, feeling Marie's eyes on him. We have time to talk about everything later. As the trauma team rushed in and police officers secured Bennett, Thomas found himself caught between the 2 women, the past he couldn't change and the present he refused to lose. Marie's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. Go with her to surgery, she said softly. Make sure she survives to testify against him. Marie, what she said about the baby dash. Later, she cut him off, but her voice was gentle. Right now, be her doctor. We'll figure out the rest afterward. Thomas nodded, following the gurney toward the elevator. But as the doors closed, he caught one last glimpse of his wife, standing straight and strong in the chaos she'd helped create, and he knew with sudden clarity which future he was fighting for. In the operating room, monitoring Lily's fragile heart for the 3rd time in as many days, Thomas finally understood that sometimes the hardest surgeries weren't about fixing what was broken, but about removing what was poisoned, clearing the way for natural healing to begin. 6 months later, the Boston courthouse steps gleamed in the autumn sunlight. Thomas watched as Lily emerged from the heavy doors, surrounded by a swarm of reporters. She looked stronger now, her face fuller, her step steady. The conviction of Richard Bennett on multiple counts of fraud, assault, and attempted murder had finally given her back something surgery never could, her freedom. Ms. Mitchell. How does it feel knowing Bennett will spend the next 20 years in prison? Are you planning to sue the medical corporations involved in the Medicare fraud? What about your relationship with Dr. Anderson? Lily handled the questions with newfound confidence, her voice clear and unwavering. Justice has been served. Now, I'm looking forward to building a new life, one without fear or manipulation. Thomas turned away from the scene, walking to where Marie waited by their car. The past 6 months had been a gauntlet of depositions, testimony, and painful conversations. But somehow, through it all, his marriage had not just survived, it had grown stronger. She did well up there, Marie observed, watching Lily handle the press. The jury never stood a chance once she told her story. Neither did Bennett's defense, Thomas agreed, remembering how Marie's meticulous preparation had systematically dismantled every attempt to discredit Lily's testimony. You were brilliant in there. I had good motivation. Marie's fingers intertwined with his. Some things are worth fighting for. The sound of approaching footsteps made them turn. Lily stood there, looking uncertain for the first time since the verdict. I wanted to thank you both, she said quietly. Without you, I'd still be trapped in his web. You saved yourself, Marie replied. We just helped clear the path. An uncomfortable silence fell, heavy with unspoken words about the past. Finally, Lily reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, different from the one that had started everything, but no less significant. I'm moving to Seattle, she announced. There's a cardiac research foundation there doing amazing work with survivors of domestic abuse. They've offered me a position as a patient advocate. That's wonderful, Thomas said sincerely, feeling the last weight of guilt lifting from his shoulders. You'll be excellent at that. Before I go, I want you to have this. She handed the envelope to both of them. It's everything I should have told you 10 years ago, Thomas. And everything you deserve to know, Marie. About the baby, about why I left, about all of it. I know it won't change the past, but maybe it will help you understand. Marie took the envelope, but didn't open it. Are you sure you want us to have this? I'm sure, Lily smiled sadly. My therapist says healing isn't just about moving forward, it's about making peace with where you've been. I've carried these secrets long enough. A car pulled up, Sarah Chen, who had become Lily's friend through all of this. Your flight leaves in 2 hours, she called out. We should get going. Lily nodded, then surprised them both by hugging Marie. Take care of him, she whispered. He deserves someone strong enough to fight beside him, not for him. Then she was gone, leaving Thomas and Marie standing in the autumn sunshine with an envelope full of answers they might or might not need. Should we read it? Thomas asked, watching Marie turn the envelope over in her hands. I don't think so. She held it out to him. The past belongs in the past. We know enough to understand, and that's all we need. Together, they walked to the courthouse garden, where a small fire pit decorated the center of the gathering space. Marie struck a match, and they watched the envelope curl and blacken in the flames. Take me home, she said softly, and Thomas heard everything she wasn't saying, about trust rebuilt, about choices made and remade, about the difference between letting go and moving on. That evening, in their kitchen, Thomas cooked while Marie worked on case files at the counter. The normality of it felt like a gift, one he'd nearly lost without realizing its value. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily, a picture of her boarding pass, and 3 simple words, be happy, both. Marie looked up from her work, catching his expression. Okay. Better than okay, he replied, and meant it. Coming around the counter, he pulled her into his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. You know what I learned from all this? Sometimes the strongest hearts aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones that learn how to heal, not despite the scars, but because of them. Marie smiled against his chest. Is that your professional medical opinion, Dr. Anderson? No, he kissed the top of her head. That's my personal one. Outside their window, Boston's lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere over the western horizon, a plane carried Lily toward her new beginning. But here, in this moment, Thomas held his whole world in his arms and knew with absolute certainty that while the past might leave its marks on every heart, it was the future that truly mattered. And his future, scarred but stronger, was right where it belonged.